People just could not understand why these crows kept showing up around this old and sad-looking man. He came to the park every single day, and without fail, the crows would show up with him, creating an early sight. He never showed any emotion, but when one of the crows dropped something at his feet, he suddenly burst into tears. Only then did people truly start to figure out what was going on. A couple people who had seen what happened went over to try and comfort the old man. But in all honesty, they were more curious as to what the crow had just dropped at his feet that had resulted in this extreme reaction. But this was not as easy as it sounded, as the crows would turn on anybody that approached the old man, like they were protecting him. But as you might expect, crows are no match for curious humans, and soon the onlookers had made their way to the old man. When they saw what was laying in the grass in front of him, their jaws collectively dropped to the floor. They immediately understood why the man was so emotional now. But what had the crow dropped at the old man's feet? Why was he crying because of it? And why did the crows defend him so much? Before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Many people in the neighborhood had come to recognize this particular old man. For the past couple of weeks, the old man had been seen almost every day at the public park. He was known to spend hours at the spot without uttering a word. The man always went to the park alone, but he was often seen with a couple of birds. These birds were seen roaming around the old man. The park was known to be filled with standard pigeons, but large crows always surrounded the old man. This scenario baffled people every time they walked past him. The fact that large crows seemed to only show up at the man's arrival at the spot always made people look at the man suspiciously. The birds were so large that their size would have drawn a lot of attention if they had been at the park often. Since nobody knew the man had to do with the birds, they only hoped they would uncover the mystery one day. Since the man was at the park on a regular basis, people who visited the park often to have fun by playing with their children or walking their dogs started to give him much thought. Everyone who saw him always thought something about him. The man's sight always left, usually remained in the minds of the people. People had been passing by the man all the time. No one ever saw him feed the crows or interact with them in the least possible way. He often didn't seem to acknowledge their presence. Even though the man never paid attention to them, the crows were always with the man until he left the park each day. With the man's constant visit to the park, the regular visitors could no longer keep their cool due to their heightened curiosity. Since nobody had ever approached the man to know about him, and the mystery behind the birds he was always surrounded with, they decided to hold on to their own notion of him. With time, some people could not keep up with their idea about him. They decided to approach him. Surprisingly, all the people who came up to him to ask a question never got a response. The old man ignored everyone that came to him, just as he did with the crows. Most times, he kept his head down and never bothered to look those who approached him in the eyes. Since all the people's efforts to uncover the mystery behind the man proved abortive, they began to have wild speculations about him. Some began to view him as a devil that should be avoided by all means. But in the real sense, all the speculations were far from being the reality. The old man's name was James. The past few years of his life had not been kind to him, as he was a widower living alone. He lived close to the park, and that was why it was his usual routine to take a walk and have some fresh air at his usual spot by the public park. The old man had an only son. The son has to leave his father's house to the abroad to live with his wife, whom he found in France. Not too long after he left, Judith, James's wife, became ill. Judith's sickness was so severe that it required intense treatment. Judith's sickness and treatment almost led to the man's bankruptcy. It was unfortunate that in spite of all the old man did, his wife didn't survive the illness. At the wife's demise, James became so devastated that the occurrence changed his perspective on life. The grief made him almost lose his mind, such that he became a shadow of himself. James used to be an optimistic man before his wife died. As a result of Judith's death, he became a sad and bitter person. The adverse event affected him so much that he lost interest in interacting with people. At the same, James couldn't stay at home all day because it could make him go crazy entirely. Since sitting home all day wasn't a good option for him, he decided to take a stroll every day. After taking a walk to the park a few times, he realized that he had found some solace in the event. Soon he began going out to sit at the park for hours with nobody noticing him. Since the event seemed ideal to him, he decided to always go to the park every day. Ever since he made the decision, the event became the only thing that awoke him from sleep every morning. His solitary moment at the park soon became a thing of the past by one happening. On a fateful day, James was sitting on a bench at the park and was taking in the peace and quietness of the environment when a crow suddenly landed on his bench. His deep thought about his wife was stopped by the crows, which landed beside him on the bench. James got afraid of the presence of the crows. He felt the crows were big enough to peck his eye off or hurt in other ways, so he tried to scare the animal away. The man was left to wonder if the bird thought it could get food from him, as the crow was reluctant to leave him. The crow was with James the rest of the time he spent at the park on that fateful day. He thought that was all about the crow when the bird departed, as he was about to leave for home that day. To his greatest surprise, the crow always returned to James every day he was at the park. Not long after then, more crows joined. Before he realized it, he was always with a small army of crows at all times at the park. This left him to wonder what could be drawing the birds' attention. Since he couldn't uncover why the birds were drawn to him, he became used to their presence and worried no more about them. He got aware that people were always looking at and talking about him. People said many unkind things about him. He agreed that he was old, but he knew he was not blind or deaf, and neither was he the evil person people thought he was. After much thought about the situation, he decided that ignoring them was actually the best thing to do to avoid their drama. It got to a time that James couldn't take the name-calling anymore, and he decided to change his routine a bit. He decided to go to the park in the afternoon, as he was known for being at the spot in the morning. He made his way to the park one afternoon. Fortunately for him, the weather was excellent, and the park was unusually busy that day. As soon as James got to the park, he got himself a seat on one of the few free benches available. Immediately after settling down to enjoy the sun a bit, the crows started flying towards him again. Before long, about 10 crows were hanging around him. As usual, the presence of the birds hovering around him drew a lot of attention to him. The people were so distracted by the scene that they began to crowd around James's bench within a few minutes. Even though James tried not to look up while the people were gathered around him, he couldn't keep to his decision for so long as the people were saying all sorts about him. Then one of the crows came up to him and dropped an old ring at his feet. He immediately thought back to his late wife and burst into tears. He did not know where this crow had got this, but he decided to keep the ring, and he kept visiting his new friends nearly every day.